The Arctic doesn't forgive. It doesn't care for flags, ranks, or history books. It records nothing but the cold. In the farthest reaches of Europe, where daylight fades for months and the sea freezes into sheets of glass, a forgotten war was fought, a war of frostbite, hunger, and steel. It wasn't Normandy or the Pacific. It was the Arctic front, a theater of World War II so merciless that even soldiers' trenches elsewhere dismissed it as legend. It began not with armies, but with convoys. Metallic armadas ferrying hope across oceans so cold that diesel turned to syrup. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 78 convoys braved the North Atlantic, threading from Britain and Iceland to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Each route skirted the Arctic Circle, crossing the realm of midnight sun and polar night, a supply lifeline of tanks, trucks, aircraft, and grain that sealed the pact between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. The men who sailed north called it the suicide run. They knew the routine: blizzards that erased horizons, mountains of ice shifting like beasts under the hull, and German aircraft waiting just beyond cloud cover. Cold killed faster than bullets. A man thrown overboard had less than 3 minutes before the sea stole him. Yet thousands volunteered, believing that every crate of supplies through meant one less day of war. On land, Norway had already become the knife edge of strategy. Since 1940, Germany had occupied the country to secure Atlantic ports and its access to Sweden's iron ore, vital to Hitler's factories. The occupation turned Norway into a fortress empire, over 350,000 German troops digging into fjords, tunnels, and mountains. Somewhere within that icy maze lay one of the war's invisible prizes, the port of Narvik, gateway to the far north, and the only harbor where warm Atlantic currents could keep shipping lines alive through winter. By 1941, Hitler's eyes turned east and Operation Barbarossa erupted. Now the Arctic acquired new meaning. Northern Norway became the launch pad for the Gebirgsjäger, the mountain troops assaulting across the tundra toward Murmansk, a campaign waged beyond civilization. The German plan, codenamed Silberfuchs, Silver Fox, aimed to crush Soviet defenses from Finland and Norway simultaneously, cut the Murmansk Railway, and sever the Allied lifeline to Russia before it truly began. But the Arctic plays no favorites. The invaders soon discovered that even courage freezes. German infantry advanced across wastelands where compasses failed and polar daylight blurred day and night. Temperatures plunged to -40°C. Tanks wouldn't start, oil turned to wax, rifles jammed under hoarfrost, bread became stone. Men slept beside running engines for warmth and woke to find boots fused to the ground. The landscape devoured machines like a slow, merciless predator. Opposite them, Soviet soldiers defended the Kola Peninsula with equal desperation, many barely clothed, some fighting with reindeer-drawn sleds when fuel ran out. Local Arctic tribes, Sami herders, guided them through terrain no map could describe. Their knowledge of wind routes and frozen rivers became more valuable than any general's plan. In this theater, experience meant survival. Ignorance meant a quick, white grave. The Germans pushed to within 29 kilometers of Murmansk and stopped. Nature and resistance had fused into one barrier. Even the Luftwaffe, feared across Europe, grew helpless against fog, snow, and sudden sun glare that cracked windshields mid-flight. Commanders began rating missions not by enemy casualties but by frostbite cases. Men's faces blackened, they lost hands without knowing it. For most of the world, the Arctic front was invisible. Newsreels couldn't film heroism buried under blizzards, and no propaganda camera survived long enough to glamorize it. Yet up there, above the Arctic Circle, the war wrote new definitions of endurance. Convoys still came, hugging the ice edge, haunted by U-boats, Luftwaffe dive bombers, and the endless night. Each success was measured in ships not sunk. In December 1942, the convoy PQ-17 learned the cost of Arctic hope. 35 merchant ships left Iceland with escorts, British, American, and Free Norwegian, carrying supplies equal to an army's heartbeat. Somewhere off Nordkapp, German admirals released the Tirpitz, the battleship giant sleeping in fjords like a waiting wolf. When British command heard the rumor, panic spread. Orders came down to scatter. Convoy PQ-17 dissolved into isolated silhouettes under 24-hour daylight skies, hunted one by aircraft and submarines. Of 35 ships, only 11 reached Russia. The Arctic turned bloodless massacre into silence, waves closing over wrecks with indifferent grace. Seamen later said the Arctic had no smell of death, only cold. The survivors who reached Murmansk found not glory, but Soviet dock workers frozen to cranes, hands raw from unloading crates in temperatures far below zero. Yet when they saw those supplies, tanks, boots, wheat, Soviet soldiers cheered. The Arctic had claimed half their allies, but what survived was enough to keep the Eastern Front alive. For the Allies, the Arctic route became sacred. Every convoy that followed wore its ghosts like medals. Sailors taped heating coils to their beards to prevent frostbite, wrapped steering wheels in rope, and carved good luck charms from shards of ice. Somewhere between the roar of engines and the hiss of sleet, they learned that heroism doesn't need an audience, only purpose. After the blinding polar sun of 1941 faded, what followed was not darkness, but a haunting blue half-light that lasted months. Here, on the rim of the world where no sound carries far, the Arctic front turned into one of the strangest, most brutal deadlocks in history. The German plan, Operation Silberfuchs, the push to choke Murmansk from the north, had met resistance from something far older than any army, the land itself. Every ridge became a wall of ice, every step soaked in snow that swallowed rifles whole. Men had fought before in deserts and jungles, but never in a place that refused to acknowledge human life. The offensive stalled mere kilometers from its objective. From that moment until 1944, this forgotten front froze into stalemate, a 3-year duel waged not for conquest, but for endurance. The German Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops drilled in the Tyrolean Alps, found their training hollow here. Their mules died from cold, and engines cracked pistons overnight. Ammunition boxes froze shut. Soldiers lined mittens with newspaper, lit fires inside pits dug from snow, rotated sentries every 15 minutes to stave off frostbite. They began to call the Kola Front Der ewige Winter, the eternal winter. Across the line of permafrost, Soviet troops faced equal misery. Units of the 14th Army, including the 52nd Independent Rifle Brigade, clung to the port of Murmansk and the Litsa River Valley, their supply chain barely a thread over rough gravel roads. Reinforcements arrived by convoy and sled dog in equal measure. When gasoline ran out, small reindeer teams hauled mortars and ammunition through blizzards that blinded visibility to a meter. Reports describe dispatch riders skiing between trenches, rifles slung across their backs, faces covered in frost dust. The Arctic turned soldiers into animals of instinct. Ambushes vanished into silence. Death froze mid-expression. No one dared shout because breath would crystallize inside their scarves. By 1942, the Finnish front further east had evolved into its own paradox. Finland, invaded by the Soviet Union in 1939, had later joined Germany in what it called the Continuation War, not for ideology but revenge. Its purpose: reclaim lost territory and secure its existence between two giants. And yet, even as Finland fought alongside the Wehrmacht, it refused to become Hitler's puppet. It harbored its own code: fight the Soviets, yes, but protect Finnish land from Nazi control. Thus, in the labyrinth of the Arctic, alliances twisted into pretzels of survival and distrust. Finnish and German troops camped side by side in Lapland's forests, exchanging scarce vodka and song. But their letters home revealed exhaustion. We fight the wind more than the enemy. In those nights of half-light, a new danger stalked them. Not bullets, but polar madness. Endless sun followed by endless black made time meaningless. Records mentioned soldiers who dug foxholes they never left, believing daylight would return only if they remained perfectly still. Commanders spoke seldom of such cases. Discipline was easier than despair. And still, convoys crawled through the Barents Sea above them, luminous steel caterpillars under curtains of snow. Every shipment that broke through carried fuel for Red Army tanks around Stalingrad, copper for Soviet shells, and wheat to keep men alive through sieges in the south. Without the Arctic route, the war on the Eastern Front would have shattered. Stalin called Murmansk our lungs to the world. It was the only Soviet port above ice all year, thanks to warm Atlantic currents that defied geography. The Germans understood its importance and threw steel after steel trying to suffocate it. In the fjords of northern Norway lurked giants, the battleships Tirpitz and Scharnhorst, waiting for convoys like wolves in tall grass. Every time those gray hulls stirred, British sailors in distant bases felt terror ripple across the radio waves. To counter them, the Royal Navy deployed new strategies. Long-range Catalina patrol planes scouting through weeks of darkness, radar installations carved into cliffs, destroyers that fought both submarines below and icebergs above. One eyewitness wrote, "Ice formed faster than we could chip it. The deck rose white as marble, the ship heavier by the hour. We prayed not to roll, because if we capsized, we'd shatter like glass." In 1943, fate struck in dramatic symmetry. The convoy JW-55B steamed toward Murmansk under blizzard cover. The German High Command, desperate for victory, unleashed the Scharnhorst. British codebreakers detected its departure, guiding Admiral Fraser's fleet in a deadly ambush through radar and Arctic night. On December 26, the two groups collided beneath swirling snow, the last great battleship duel fought in Europe's northern void. When silence returned, Scharnhorst lay shattered beneath the icy waves, taking 932 men to a glacial grave. Only 36 survived. The Arctic, impartial as ever, closed over them without ripple or mercy. Meanwhile, on land, Soviet radio intercepts revealed that German troops were starving. Supply convoys south from Finland could not cross mountain passes. Luftwaffe drop planes froze mid-air. Soldiers burned wooden rifle stocks for warmth. Command gave them camouflage smocks of white canvas, but the snow turned pink from blood of cracked feet and hands. Letters recovered decades later told their unspoken terror. "We have fought the snow longer than we have fought the Russians. One is indifferent, the other never sleeps. Together they are unbeatable." Yet men persisted. Duty became habit, breathing became victory. By mid-1943, both armies had entrenched so deeply that the Arctic front ceased to resemble strategy. It was a burial ground of motors and bone. Patrols skied over wrecked half-tracks poking through permafrost like skeletons. Still, command kept the illusion of movement alive. New maps, new arrows, same terrain. Then, in summer's brief thaw, nature reminded both sides who ruled. Meltwater flooded trenches. Plagues of mosquitoes descended from swamps, infecting weakened soldiers with fever. In one bizarre truce, Soviets and Germans drew fire toward the insects rather than each other, machine guns spitting upward like mechanical prayers to no god. But history was shifting elsewhere. Stalingrad had fallen. The Red Army had begun its giant westward surge. By 1944, with Germany retreating on every front, the frozen stalemate cracked. Stalin ordered a new counteroffensive, the Petsamo-Kirkenes operation, to reclaim the entire Arctic. Soviet generals mustered forces that had learned to fight in snow like natives, backed by vehicles on skis, thousands of sled dogs, rocket artillery wrapped in winter canvas. Allied air coverage thundered over them, drawn north from Norway's thawing bases. The German 19th Mountain Army crumbled. They had held the Arctic for 3 years, and now had nowhere to run except into darkness. Columns began retreating across Lapland, torching every bridge, every hut, every village, their scorched earth order meant to slow pursuit. Houses burned like orange scars against blue snow, reindeer scattered under falling ash. Civilians fled through forests that glowed with embers visible for miles. It became known as the Lapland War, though it was no longer two sides but one army consuming another landscape in resignation. Finland, now seeking separate peace with the Allies, turned against its former German partners. Finnish partisans fought guerrilla battles in forests they had once shared with those same men. The Arctic had become civil war in twilight. When the Red Army finally reached the Norwegian border, dragging fuel barrels on sledges and lowering banners over shattered peaks, they found more ice than enemy. Entire garrisons had melted into retreat southward. Liberation here looked nothing like Paris or Prague. No parades, no crowds, only the sound of wind threading through burned timber. By November 1944, the Arctic front as a battlefield ceased to exist, but its story was already fading, buried under the din of Central Europe's closing acts. Newspapers wrote of breakthroughs in Poland and Berlin. Few spared words for soldiers who spent years fighting glaciers. Still, every convoy that sailed after that date, every last trail of ships pushing supplies into the dying storm, owed its safe passage to those frozen ghosts who held lines no historian could find on a normal map. By the winter of 1944, the Arctic had become the last great heartbeat of the Allied alliance. a frozen artery pulsing between nations that mistrusted each other but could not survive apart. Everything now rode through those convoys, snaking across the Barents Sea. Food, planes, trucks, oil, gun barrels, even entire factories disassembled and boxed into steel containers. The war elsewhere was mobile, frenetic, loud. The war here was slow, murmuring, and endless. To the sailors threading that narrow corridor of mortality, the geography of fear had names: Bear Island, North Cape, Tirpitz Water. Each convoy was a roll of the dice against weather, darkness, and enemies they could rarely see. No line of supply anywhere on Earth had a lower temperature or a higher death rate than the Arctic convoys. They departed from Loch Ewe in Scotland or Hvalfjörður in Iceland, creaking through snow squalls before gathering into tight boxes of visibility, bound for the Soviet North. Once they left the shelter of the British coast, they entered corridors of unbroken ice and light that never changed. The sun hung at the same angle for hours. Compasses drifted unpredictably near the pole. Frozen spray turned to stone on deck rails. Men chipped it off every hour to keep the ships from top-heavy capsizing. Inside those steel shells were crews of all ages: farm boys from Iowa, fishermen from Norway, gunners from Newcastle, stokers from Leningrad. Their world smelled of diesel, coffee, and death. Every lookout traced the horizon compulsively for periscopes. They called it watching for angels, because only faith kept you staring at gray nothing for 12 hours while the thermometer read -20 Celsius. German U-boats stalked them like sharks under glass. The Arctic water was so dense that sonar pings traveled farther, but the cold bent echoes unpredictably. Submariners could see the underside of icebergs through periscopes, luminous as ghosts. Their orders were ruthless: destroy everything that floated east. Yet the convoys kept coming punctually, mechanically, methodically. For morale, the Royal Navy Command invented rituals: shipwide cocoa nights, harmonica concerts, competitions for the least frozen mug of coffee. But nothing could mask the exhaustion. Frostbite attacked faces and hands before anyone felt pain. Once, during convoy JW58, the destroyer HMS Bulldog rescued a half-frozen Norwegian sailor clinging to driftwood. His tongue had turned black from cold. When asked his name, he whispered, "Just mark my ship safe." By early 1945, supply statistics told an impossible truth. More than 4 million tons of materiel had reached the Soviet Union via the Arctic. A victory of measurement, perhaps, but each ton was paid for in bone and nerve. British historians would later call it a war within a war. Even nature rebelled. In December, an ice storm swallowed convoy RA-62 on its return to Britain. Visibility dropped to 0. Radar screens blinked with static. The convoy's escorts, like blind shepherds, shouted bearings over crackling radios. Somewhere beneath them, U-boats fired by guesswork into the storm. 2 ships vanished without even explosions. Their lifeboats found capsized days later, draped in rime so thick that rescuers had to chip bodies out as though sculpting marble. Yet amid tragedy, there was communion. Arctic sailors spoke of an eerie beauty: the aurora rippling above convoys like a cathedral ceiling of green flame, the way radio masts glowed from static charge during blizzards, haloing ships in phantom light. One gunner wrote home, "When the northern lights shine, even hell looks bearable." In late 1944, an engine that had haunted the Arctic since the first year, the battleship Tirpitz, finally met her end. British bombers struck from the sky, dropping tall-boy earthquake bombs that hit through mist with unearthly precision. The shockwave flipped her in seconds, trapping nearly 1,000 men beneath. For Allied sailors, that sinking marked a cosmic turning point. The wolf that had hunted them for years was gone. Still, the convoys kept their guard. Every iceberg looked like a periscope, every patch of fog like incoming doom. Beyond the horizon, the liberation of Norway had begun. Soviet troops advancing from the east met Norwegian resistance groups, guiding them through fjords lit only by burning villages. The ice front cracked open. Germans fled south, leaving caches of ammunition frozen solid, where spring floods would one day wash them into rivers. In Murmansk, the unloading never stopped. Soviet dockers worked 3 shifts a day through polar night. Their cranes froze in mid-swing. Workers defrosted them with blowtorches borrowed from ship crews. English and Russian voices mingled over wailing wind. None could understand the other's words, yet all understood hurry. As one captain put it, there were no languages in the Arctic, only breath. On rare calm days, sailors disembarked and stared inland at the Black Mountains. There were no cities, no farms, only tundra expanding endlessly. It made them realize how small victory really was, how far human ambition had stretched just to keep petrol flowing into tanks thousands of miles away. Then came tragedy by accident, the loss of HMS Goodall, April 1945. Moments before peace headlines would circle the globe, one more torpedo found one more ship. The explosion split it in half. Men thrown into zero-degree water never surfaced. Survivors were scooped up by Soviet cutters, their beards bejeweled with ice. The war ended for them on the deck of strangers under an aurora they were too cold to admire. When Germany surrendered in May, the Arctic convoys dissolved quietly. Their ships turned south, engines stuttering with relief. There were no bands playing at port, no victory parades, only salt-white hulls rusting in the sun. Those men who survived carried frostbite scars that never fully healed and a silence that never left. Civilization moved on. New wars took stages with warmer lights. The Arctic front disappeared into footnotes, a logistical miracle, a nightmare rarely shown on screen. But for those who had lived it, the screams of fractured ice and crashing waves echoed louder than any artillery. One British commander summarized it simply: "We guarded a road through nowhere. We won nothing but tomorrow, and that was enough." When the guns finally went silent in May 1945, the Arctic did not celebrate. It simply exhaled. The ice kept shifting, indifferent, grinding the remnants of fleets and armies back into its white skin. Ships that survived limped south, their hulls salted with ghosts. For the men who'd lived on the roof of the world, peacetime felt too warm, too bright, as if their eyes had forgotten how to blink without snow. The Northern Front was officially over, but nothing there truly ended. Whole divisions remained buried under the permafrost, entire convoys fossilized beneath ice shelves. Stalin's Soviet Union sealed the region almost immediately after victory. Murmansk turned into both a hero city and a fortress of secrecy. The war's relics became state property. The graves became coordinates on forbidden maps. Western veterans who had fought their own kind of war, the freezing, invisible one, returned home to quiet pension papers marked Arctic service. There were no medals for frostbite, no parade for those who chipped ice instead of storming beaches. But time gave them something different: perspective. As the Cold War dawned, they realized they had written its first paragraph. The same ports where convoys had unloaded food and guns now launched submarines and listening posts. The alliance their efforts built turned overnight into rivalry. Britain and the United States guarding seas they had once shared with Russia. The Barents Sea, once a road of alliance, became a border of suspicion, marked by sonar buoys and radar ghosts. For fishermen who returned to Norway's northern coast, the evidence of war lay everywhere. Anchors embedded in fjord bottoms, rusting periscopes, patches of seabed glowing faintly under the aurora where oil seeped from wrecks. Yet those wrecks also became ecosystems, gardens of kelp and coral rising from old iron. Even in peace, the Arctic continued its habit of turning destruction into silence. Local communities began piecing memory back together. In Kirkenes, Norwegians raised simple monuments, a stone anchor facing east, names carved by hand. In Murmansk, Soviet veterans marched once a year through snow to lay red carnations at the Alyosha statue, a giant soldier overlooking the harbor with a rifle pointing toward the invisible horizon. They said it guarded the road the Westerners had built across the sea. Few Westerners were allowed to visit, but the sentiment reached them anyway through whispers and post-war newspapers. The Frozen Brothers, Russians called them. For decades, the Arctic War remained a locked chest of unfinished stories. Official histories focused on Stalingrad, Normandy, Midway, places where heat and color made film reels easier. The Arctic had no witnesses, only ice. Yet every few years, trawlers dragged up reminders: shells covered in barnacles, lifeboat timbers, sometimes a frozen hand tightly gripping a ship's railing. Those finds stirred brief headlines before vanishing again beneath modern noise. By the 1970s, when sonar surveys traced the ocean floor with new precision, the cemetery revealed itself, a scatter of hulls stretching from Iceland to Novaya Zemlya. Scientists recorded sonar echoes and nicknamed clusters of wrecks with tragic poetry: the corridor of smoke, the long night. Each site held stories preserved by temperature itself. Cargo manifests intact, newspapers legible, the frozen ghosts of Convoy PQ-17 and RA-62 still waiting for morning. Divers who descended reported a strange phenomenon. At depth, bioluminescent plankton shimmered across gun barrels and aircraft shells, transforming decay into light. It's as if the sea refuses to forget, one said afterward. The political ice of the Cold War thawed slowly. When Soviet and British veterans met at reunions in the 1980s, translation hardly mattered. In a Murmansk gymnasium, thick with cigarette smoke, old sailors embraced, men who 60 years earlier had waved at each other through blizzards under the same aurora. One British boatswain told reporters, "We never saw their faces during the war. Now I see they look exactly like us." As the century turned, fragments of the Arctic front surfaced again. Historians uncovered diaries caked in frost, revealing quiet details. A Norwegian medic using whale oil as antiseptic, a Finnish scout marking distances by counting heartbeats. None of it changed the grand map of World War II, but it changed how the war felt, smaller, colder, intensely human. Today, expedition teams continue to search the polar seabed, guided by sonar pings bouncing from shadows of submarines and cargo hulls. Each discovery adds a paragraph to a book few nations remember to open. When they raise artifacts, a rusted compass, an engine bell, it isn't only archaeology, it's an apology whispered through salt water. The Arctic of today is warming faster than any place on Earth. Ice that resisted tanks and bombers now retreats under the soft weapon of time. Shipwrecks long hidden are emerging through translucent water, bronze bells glinting under sun once denied to them. Scientists warn that even history itself is melting out of its own preservation. What was once frozen truth is turning into memory again, fallible, fragile, vanishing. And yet, for the men who were there or their thinning descendants, the Arctic still has a voice. On windless nights, when the northern lights ripple in slow motion, it sounds like radio static, like the Morse of convoys calling through eternity. PQ to Murmansk, JW to Kola, still on course. The unknown story of the Arctic front lives there between silence and survival. It reminds us that wars are not only won in noise or heat or marching drums, but also in frozen places where breath itself rebels. No monument can capture the loneliness of that victory. No film reel can show a sailor scraping ice from his ship at 3 in the morning while the compass spins uselessly. But somewhere deep in the Barents, beneath 12 miles of sea and a sleepless sky, rest the answers. Steel, wood, and bone arranged like script. Proof that humanity once dared to fight not for territory or ideology, but simply to endure where nothing living belonged. The Arctic keeps its witnesses under glass. The water is their archive, the cold their curator. When the wind shifts north and the sea begins to whisper against the fjords, perhaps that's their applause, soft, endless, and eternal. The silence that followed was not peace, only the sound of history turning its page.